Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tools, the travel company led by reporters around the world. It's now been over 50 years since Turkey seized the northern half of Cyprus in response to a Greek-backed coup. Since then, the north has become a haven for dark money, dodgy businessmen and phony academic institutions, all under Turkey's nose. Reunification could get rid of all of that in one fell swoop and return property on both sides to their original owners. If only it were that simple, says our Cyprus tour expert, Professor James Ker-Lindsay. He joins us now to give us a general overview of the island, north and south. Hello and welcome, James.
Hello, Nicholas. How are you? Good to see you.
Great to have you with us again. I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. I should start off by saying that you actually live in Cyprus with your wife, and you live in one of the few mixed villages on the island. Just tell us a bit about that there.
In fact, actually, now, sadly, the only mixed village in Cyprus. So it's a place called Pila, which, as you well remember, we visited, which is now a place that I call home. And I remember when I announced to some friends from the UN a couple of years ago that I was coming to live in Cyprus and I was moving to Pila, and they just sort of said my whole life, my whole career had been heading to that one moment of ending up in this one mixed village. And it's a fascinating place to be. It's actually a really lovely place. It's very close to the sea. And it's at a really bizarre spot. So where I'm talking to you right now, I'm just in the Republic. If I were to travel about 300 meters that direction, I'd be in the UN buffer zone. If I go about 800 meters that direction, I would be in the British sovereign military base. And if I went about 1.5 kilometers that direction behind me, I'd be in the Turkish north. So you've got about 4 distinct jurisdictions within the space of maybe a couple of miles from here. So it's a very, very strange place, but very interesting, as you can imagine. And, the locals rub along well together. There's very few problems between them. There have been some incidents here back in the summer of 2023, just as I was actually getting on the boat to start my new life back here in Cyprus. I'd lived here many years before. The news broke that there'd been clashes between British forces and Turkish civilians, supposedly here in Pila, but it's nice and calm. And as you saw,
the Turks were trying to build a new road, really assert sovereignty in that area there. Really, I want to, just before we get into this, because we're going to explain all of those difference of sovereign areas, competing interest zones, as it were. But just for those who don't know, just take us back to 1974. What happened there that started all of this?
All right, so I'm actually going to jump back just a little bit further than that. So essentially, Cyprus had been under the Ottoman Empire for a very long time. And in 1878, it became British. It wasn't technically a British colony until a lot later. It was sort of loaned to Britain to be a deep water port for the newly built Suez Canal, but it was actually useless because it doesn't actually have deep water port facilities. So Britain was sort of lumbered with this. But cut a long story short, by the 1950s, decolonization was continuing. Pressure grew on Britain to try and give it up. And it was very reluctant to do so. But there was an armed uprising from the Greek Cypriots. And eventually the decision was taken by Greece and Turkey that rather than enter into a civil war, rather than let this become an interstate war between Greece and Turkey, they'd make Cyprus an independent state. And a complex power sharing agreement was put in place between the Greek Cypriots, who were about 80% of the population, and the Turkish Cypriots, who absolutely resent and hate being called a minority, who represented 20%. And essentially within about 3 or 4 years, that broke down. And so in 1964, you had the creation of a UN force. And that sort of held the line for about 10 years. But many Greek Cypriots had really, in their hearts, they didn't want to become independent. They wanted to become part of Greece. And in 1974, the Greek military government gave the green light for an attempt to overthrow the Cypriot leadership to try and bring about that union. And effectively, Turkey, well, not effectively, Turkey did invade, and Cyprus, has been divided. So 36% is now under the control of Turkey and Turkish troops, and the Turkish Cypriots have formed their own administration, which declared independence in 1983. And so what we're dealing with effectively in that potted history is now a divided island where, as you note, it's been 50 years since Turkish invasion and 60 years since the UN arrived here. These were three big anniversaries last year, alongside the anniversary of Cyprus joining the European Union in 2004. So what you've had is this major international engagement for 60 years by the UN to try and solve this problem, and it remains unsolved. And the news hot off the press is that the UN Under Secretary General was here yesterday, Rosemary DiCarlo, an American diplomat, and they've suddenly said they're going to convene talks in Geneva next month to see if they can get the ball rolling on another process. I have to say, I don't think anyone's particularly positive that it's going to lead anywhere, but I think, the feeling is that, as somebody recently said to me, any process is better than no process. So yeah. Interesting times here.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to talk a bit about those attempts to find a solution, and then the outlines, I think, of some kind of solution has been there for a long time. So we'll come back to that in a second. But what I do want to give people is an idea of what you actually see on the island. I think many people are going to be familiar with the tourist sites, mainly in the south, along the coast. And that's not where we go, and that's not what we seek to explore. We actually seek to explore the areas of contention. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share a document here, if I can find it. Yeah, if I will. Here's hopefully I'll get the right button here. And I'm going to go back. I'm going to get ticked off by my wife for not having the right screen up. But there we go. I think. Hang on, go back up one more. There we go.
Oh, a brief glimpse of Mete.
Yeah. So this is actually right bang in the center. This is in the capital. This is in Nicosia. And we are looking in a kind of no man's land where there's, funnily enough, a football pitch. But just give us what are we looking at and why is this significant?
So, all right. So that picture actually really does tell 1,000 words, and that's a lot of history piled into one picture. So those walls that you actually see there are the old ancient Venetian walls. So before Cyprus became Ottoman, it was one of the last sort of bastions of the Venetian Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean before it was conquered, and that was at the end of the 16th century. And the walls still exist in Cyprus, and as you can imagine, for a long time, they marked the old city of Nicosia. But the division of the city goes right down the middle of it. And that's what you're seeing there. That actually is a strange part where you can see, if I can see, because it's looking quite small on my screen, are those the Turkish flags, I think, on the left-hand side?
Yeah, then you've got the Turkish flags on the left-hand side.
You've got the Turkish flag there. Then you've got the UN post. As you say, it's this football pitch, which is in no man's land. And at one point, very close to that, which we actually saw, is the narrowest point of the green line, where effectively you're standing at the top of the wall and you look straight down, and it's the other side. So the buffer zone is only maybe a meter wide. And as we heard of stories of, at one point there was, like so many else places in Europe, there was a problem with refugees and migrants, undocumented migrants. And we were hearing stories of how they would throw mattresses down and just jump to get from this de facto Turkish Cypriot state into the Republic, which, as I say, is an EU member. So it's a fascinating spot to see, and especially close up and in real life.
And for the majority of the last 5 decades, this was an area you could not cross from north to south. The two sides, really from 1974 onwards, had no contact with each other until...
So it was in 2003, and I remember the day that it happened. So pressure had been mounting amongst the Turkish Cypriot community for all sorts of reasons. Cyprus is about to join the European Union. Many Turkish Cypriots felt very left out by this. So the hope was to bring about reunification, but you had a particularly hardline Turkish Cypriot leader at the time. And the sense was that he decided to open the line because he was fully expecting that, right, okay, if I do this, it'll only be hours before fighting breaks out, and everything that I've said about not being able to trust the Greek Cypriots will be proven correct. I can close the line again and say to the Turkish Cypriot people, look, this is why I kept the line closed. It's for your own safety. But of course, that's not what happened. The line opened and you had a mass crossing. It really was. I mean, it was a Berlin Wall type moment in 2003. And I remembered sort of going down. Well, I was in my office and one of my brothers came in and said, you've got to go downtown. There's all these people who are sort of wandering around looking lost. And it was chaos for a few days because people hadn't had this opportunity in 30 years to cross this line. Or people had, but there was only one crossing point and it was very, very highly restricted. And then suddenly it was thrown open. And to this day, we've got a lot more opening points. But that, again, is one of the points that we'll see the Legia Palace crossing point and the Legia Street crossing point.
And I suppose the important point to emphasize there is that, I mean, if those people who are old enough will remember there are huge columns of refugees being forced to flee from the north. If you were a Greek Cypriot, and then some Turkish Cypriots also from the south going to the north, there was this enormous movement of people after actually considerable violence in the previous decade, and that point in 2004 was the first time in which people were able to go back and see the areas that they'd fled from.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so you had, so they used the term refugees. I mean, technically under legal, they're internally displaced persons, but, that's the term that's widely used here. You had many people who hadn't been able to go back to their homes in 30 years. And you can imagine the sense and the feeling on those days when the line first opened. But what really is incredible is that while you find a lot of Turkish Cypriots, and apparently more and more are now coming over to the south, especially because there's terrible inflation in the north. The economic situation there is very bad. And so now what you're seeing is a lot more are coming over to do shopping in the south, whereas even 5 years ago, it would be the other way. People would go to the north for cheap fuel and cheap cigarettes and alcohol. People are now coming over to the south. But it's still amazing how many Greek Cypriots, and even young Greek Cypriots, have never been over to the north or have only been once, because a lot of people still have the feeling that I will not show an ID card or a passport to travel freely in my own country. So it's still a very sensitive issue for people, but an issue that often divides families. So you'll have maybe the dad who's been over many times and the mother who says, I refuse to go. And I think people just now treat it very much as a personal decision. And if you want to go, you go. If you don't, you don't.
So tell us then, what is Turkish Northern Cyprus like? I mean, you talked about the economy there. It's a sort of a no man's land itself, isn't it? It's a bizarre situation internationally. Certainly, it's not recognised, and that has consequences.
Yes, exactly. So, it's become more and more stark, the difference between the South, which is internationally recognized and a member of the United Nations, and the European Union. Technically, the whole island is a member of the European Union and the United Nations, but you've got this legal formulation. So the Greek Cypriots will colloquially call it the occupied areas. But officially, it's the territory of the Republic, not under the effective control of the government of Cyprus, to give it its formal long title. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's become a bit of a no man's zone, and it's had a bad reputation. I mean, the South did for a long time as well, but they've really cleaned up their act in recent years and working very.
What do you mean by that, bad reputation?
Well, there was a lot of, there was a lot of Russian dirty money that was coming into the island on both sides. But as I say, what we've seen is that in the South, this has gradually been tightened up. The Republic government is working very closely now, for example, not only with the European Union, but with the United States. I believe there's a permanent FBI presence here now, which is making sure that illicit money is being cleaned up. But over in the north, it is still very much a sort of sense of Wild West. There's a lot of building that's going on. We saw a massive development over by Famagusta. And I have to say, Nick, I hadn't been there before. And I have to say that was probably the moment that most shook my faith in a Cyprus settlement, because it really hit home just the the fundamental change of facts on the ground that we saw there, and how many people now are coming in. So the Republic, the area under the control of the government, actually has the highest immigrant population in the European Union. About 20% of the population, myself included, were not born in Cyprus and are not Cypriot. In the north now, it's estimated that just 20% are Turkish Cypriots. So it's inverse.
It's incredible, isn't it? It's absolutely phenomenal.
We saw, and we saw in that massive complex that was being built. I mean, what were they saying? And it was the most bizarre mixture of people, of course, wasn't it? You know, that.
Can I just describe what it was? It was a new apartment. I mean, these are massive high-rise blocks, and there were dozens of them, and they're all sprung up not far from the shore. And you had the saleswomen there. They were women, were Russian speakers. And pertaining to be Israeli. And we know that there were apartments in which you had Lebanese, you had Iranians, you had Ukrainians, you had Russians. I mean,
Israelis, yeah.
And Israelis, a massive mix of people all together in the same area. On land that both you and I know was not actually has any legitimacy. It's actually it's Greek Cypriot land. That if you looked at a cadastral register, you'd find that the original names were families who were kicked out in 1974.
And yet we were told, and I don't think there is another word for it, a bald-faced lie about an agreement had been reached and it was all fine, it was all legal, there were going to be no problems if you bought these apartments and things like that, when of course we all knew that wasn't the case. But they were trying to sell these apartments to anyone who'd buy, and you have to ask who would do it, because it wouldn't take very long with any sort of half decent international lawyer to say, yeah, caveat emptor, you buy this very much at your own risk. But it was really truly incredible to see that building and what it said about the changes in the north. And of course, I think the other thing that stood out was that conversation that we had with the student who was explaining just how many of these universities, and when we went to EMU, which is one of the main universities in the north and a reputable one, and saying the pressure they were facing now that 23 universities had opened up in the north. I can't remember, I think we did a back of an envelope calculation that if that was in the United States and it was the same number of universities per capita, I think, I can't remember what we were saying, but it would be thousands and thousands of universities.
The key elements in the northern economy are construction, with sales of holiday homes or new residential developments, casinos and gambling, quite a bit of that. And then education, which was a surprise for me. And as you just mentioned, 23 universities building on an island that's got not that big a population, but attracting students from across the world, from Iran, many coming from Africa. And it seemed to us many of those students didn't know that they were actually not going to be within the European Union. I'll come back to these thoughts in just a second, but what I think that the emphasis there is that here we are 5 decades, this is 50 years that this situation has been allowed to develop, and this area that is not recognized internationally is continuing to create these problems. What is the settlement that you think is on the table? And I know it's very tricky to try and explain briefly. Why has it been? Why have we just sort of narrowly missed that? Why has that not been possible?
So the official formulation is that a settlement will be based on what's called a bizone or bicommunal federation, and essentially it means that there will be 2 zones. One will be, and it depends on which side you ask, the Turkish Cypriots will say one will be Turkish Cypriot, one will be Greek Cypriot. The Greek Cypriots said, well, no, one will be predominantly Turkish Cypriot, but not exclusively, and the other one will be predominantly Greek Cypriot, but not exclusive. But essentially it's a federal model that the 2 communities will effectively have their own areas. Now, what that means in real terms has never really been spelt out, and a plan was put on the table in 2004, the so-called Annan Plan, after the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, which I think most observers felt was in accordance with this. And while it was accepted by 2/3 of Turkish Cypriots, it was rejected by 3/4 of the Greek Cypriots. They were saying this is not what we thought a bizonal bicommunal federation would mean or anything. So it remains the formulation for a settlement. But I think that as the years have gone on, there's a greater and greater realization that if you are still pursuing a bizonal bicommunal federation, and I think that it does still represent the best model of a settlement, that will become increasingly loose, decentralized, so that you will have a bare minimum of functions carried out by the central government. That might, for example, be foreign affairs, defense, finance, the things that you would usually expect, immigration potentially. And then wherever possible, any other areas, agriculture, healthcare, education, would be devolved to the two sides to manage on a day-to-day basis. And I think there's a sense that that represents the best model. But there is reluctance on both sides of the line about going for it. I think that the Greek Cypriots feel very comfortable in many ways. They've carved out their own state. It's, by all accounts, very successful. It had a major financial crisis about a dozen years ago, but it overcame it very, very quickly and very successfully. And I think there are many Greek Cypriots who worry about the implication of reuniting and what that will mean for the Republic. I think the Turkish Cypriots are much more in favor of a settlement, but they're very hesitant to get into a process because they say, well, look, we've been here several times before. Even though for many decades they were the problematic side, more recently they've been more in favor of a settlement. And they say, look, we've given it two good goes in 2004 and then again in 2017. We're not going to engage in another process. We don't trust the Greek Cypriots want a settlement. So you've got this fundamental impasse that exists at the moment of both sides in their own ways are being, being obstructive. You've got the Greek Cypriots saying we want a process, but many doubt whether they want a settlement. And then you've got the Turkish Cypriots saying we want a settlement, but we don't want a process. And that is the big problem that the UN is really, on top of all the other things of trying to get them past the line on an actual deal. It's that process at the moment which is proving to be particularly tricky for the UN and will be the main subject when they meet in Geneva in March.
I'd love to get some questions, everyone. So please just do put questions in the Q&A box or just simply hit the raise your hand button. And then we'll come to you and you can put your questions directly to James. What's Turkey's position on this? One of the things that we saw, and I'm actually going to pull up the slideshow again, and then if I can just wheel right to the end, I'm going to come back to some of these things in a tick. It seems to me that Turkey, on the left-hand side, you can see a fantastic lake, an enormous lake that is full of not Cypriot water, but Turkish water literally pumped in from Turkey. It's quite symbolic.
Yes, and I mean, Turkey in many ways is the unknown at the moment. Turkey, as many will probably know, I mean, it has this president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is a very enigmatic figure. We don't really know where he stands on Cyprus at the moment. The feeling is that he feels personally let down, that he has taken Turkey towards a settlement on two occasions and he's been rebuffed. And so what we've seen in recent years is that Turkey has been taking a particularly hardline position. It installed the Turkish Cypriot leader, who goes by the title President of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but that isn't a position that's recognized by any country apart from Turkey. But there is a sense that underneath it all, Turkey is still willing to reach a settlement. It's just not willing to go through the merry-go-round of another process. And what it wants is some very, very clear indications, either that the Greek Cypriots are willing to accept the Turkish Cypriot sovereign equality, which is the big statement from the Turkish Cypriot leader, or else some sort of guarantee that if they go into talks again and they fail, and it's deemed to be the fault of the Greek Cypriots, what is the reward for the Turkish Cypriots? And I think the problem that you run into then is that nobody quite knows how how you deal with that issue. You can't be making promises to the Turkish Cypriots that they will be recognised if they go into talks again. But the Turkish Cypriots are saying, well, we're not going to go into talks unless that is put on the table. So as I say, nobody quite knows how to deal with it. And the hope is that, Turkey can be pressured to be more constructive on the talks.
The point about that, the water there, was that water is literally being pumped underneath the Mediterranean from Turkey into that dam, and there's a dependency being created there. And that's not the only thing that's happening there. There are other aspects of the North Cypriot economy that Turkey is sort of extending its claws over. There's a long-term strategy there.
Yes, exactly. And you're right. I mean, seeing the dam was incredible. I think it was also quite incredible to see how small the pipe was. I think probably in our minds we have this image of these huge cylinders that sort of ship the water, but it doesn't. But it's an absolute lifeline. Cyprus, like a lot of other countries, is suffering from water shortages. There's talk that, even though I remember back in the 80s and 90s, well, certainly in the 90s when I was living here, that there was problems with water shortages then, but then they created these desalination plants. But even those now have been overworked. And so there's talk that, they might have to start introducing in summertime some water rationing. So it's a big issue, but that lake potentially would solve the island's water problems, bringing water over from Turkey. And this is one of the arguments that some people make, that, look, a settlement actually does. You start to open up a whole range of regional cooperation initiatives with the Cyprus settlement, which is part of the reason why a lot of observers would say, well, why is it worth trying to pursue this if the sides don't want to live with each other? Well, I mean, you've got the basic issue about, invasion, occupation. But there is also this sense that you can get a Cyprus problem, that what you're going to do is unlock a lot more regional cooperation, which at the moment is hampered by this ongoing problem.
Okay, let's get some questions in. And then in a moment, we're going to talk about the UK's sovereign bases. We mustn't forget about them too. But let's take a question from Diane. Diane, go ahead, please. Just open your microphone. Go ahead.
James, you were describing what I'm calling a unitary solution for the whole island. And you also described the basis of the economy in the north. And I'm just wondering, how would the one Cyprus solution impact that economy? Because it seems to be at odds with the economy in the south.
Yes, thank you. No, this is a really, really good point. And I think that the feeling has always been that reunification would be good for the Turkish Cypriots. But I remember attending a conference a number of years ago, and it had been organized by the Scandinavian countries to talk about the economic benefits of a settlement. And I was chairing a session, and it became very tense, and it suddenly realized that the Turkish Cypriot business community were very worried about a settlement because they felt they couldn't compete with the Greek Cypriots. So you're very right. I mean, this is a key element that would need to be considered. But I think overall the sense is that there would be a lot of money that would come in with a settlement. The European Union would pump in a lot of cash to make this work. And that ultimately it would benefit the Turkish Cypriots. And I think, the other obvious comparison that's often drawn is East and West Germany. But of course, those economies were very, very different. And I think it's still amazing. I don't know if you've ever seen these maps, but somebody's put these maps together, and by almost any possible social indicator you can come up with, you can overlay it on the map, and you can immediately see where the dividing line between East and West Germany was. I mean, whether that's infant mortality, whether it's lifespan, whether it's health outcomes, incomes, any of those. I don't think you'd find that problem here in Cyprus. I mean, it's a small place. It doesn't have heavy industry, for example. Tourism is a mainstay of the economy. You've got a bit of agriculture going on, business services. All of these are areas where many people think that there would be a real benefit from a settlement, and that it would flow very quickly down to the two communities. So you probably wouldn't see an automatic equalization between the communities, but you would definitely see the Turkish Cypriot.
I suppose, James, you've got to make a distinction between the Turkish Cypriots who are indigenous to the island, and then the Russians, the Israelis, the Ukrainians who are living maybe full-time or maybe part-time in those apartments, who wouldn't have a say in the vote. And whilst they might think, is my money going to be safe here? I'm putting it here because it's not part of any international legal system, and I'm not seen here, so that's why I'm here. But their influence in politics, how big, how muted, how significant is it?
They bring money in, but it's not a huge amount. And I think that what we saw in 2004 with the UN plan there was the bigger obstacle actually came from Greek Cypriot hoteliers, who were one of the groups that funded the No campaign amongst the Greek Cypriots in 2004. Because, as we saw in the north, it's very beautiful, and more so than the south in many ways. You've got these lovely unspoiled beaches, and that view from the Kyrenia mountain range as it drops down into the sea, and when we stayed in Belopais, for example, was stunning. And you can see why many Greek Cypriots are very nervous about that. But there is the argument that, yes, exactly, Belopais, which was made very famous by the bitter lemons, that was written in the 50s, and it is a beautiful area in the north, but I think there is the feeling that, under a unified Cyprus, this would benefit all. And it's almost as though you could see the holiday brochures writing themselves, one island, two holidays. You've got the Greek experience in the south, and you've got that Turkish sense in the north. And, that difference, but a feeling that it is still all Cyprus, which could make it really interesting. All the arguments are out there. Reunification. It's just getting the people to overcome their fears and concerns. And I think the other problem that you have, and we picked up on, is that, after 50 years, the young people don't have any personal experience. I mean, it's got a little bit better since the lines opened, but I really find an enormous amount of apathy amongst the young, which is something that, political leaders and internationals who are trying to get a settlement have got to learn to engage with a bit more.
Okay, well, let's take another question then. Elaine. Just need to open your microphone, Elaine, which is probably on the bottom left-hand side of your screen.
Oh, done. Good evening, everyone.
Hello.
I've got two questions, but I think they may turn out to be connected. Earlier this evening, I was on a Zoom meeting internationally with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So my first question is, who and what are based at RAF Akrotiri? What's going on there? And what is the Russian state up to in Cyprus? Okay,
so on the question about what is based at RAF Akrotiri. Well, I mean, it is the largest British airbase outside of the United Kingdom. It's a very, very important airbase. It's been central to a lot of operations that have been carried out in the Middle East. So, for example, bombing runs that have been carried out against Houthi fighters in Yemen. There's been sort of suggestions that it's also been involved somehow with Gaza, but I think it's very difficult to know exactly. There's a lot of misinformation that goes on as well. So I don't think we know for certain. But we do know that in a lot of other Middle East campaigns, yes, the bases here in Cyprus have been very important to that. And it is one of the areas that we visited. And it was very interesting in its own right, because the British bases in Cyprus cover 99 square miles. And I think there's a sense that people often have that, the bases are just completely sealed off, that you can't travel through them or anything. But in fact, the vast majority of it is open. A lot of it's farmland. People have pointed out a lot of it's unspoiled because Britain was a lot tougher on planning regulations than the Republic. And there are Greek Cypriot villages that exist within the bases and things like that. But you do have RAF Akrotiri, which is closed off. You can go right up to the gate, which is what we did. And, if you've got somebody on the team who sort of a bit of a plane spotter and knows, can sort of identify, what's taking off, which is sort of quite interesting. But we don't
It's a
actually
stationary
know.
aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean.
Basically, yeah.
For British and US forces. So if you look at what's happening in Gaza, the British were flying AWACS aircraft over Gaza and providing the Israelis with intelligence about Hamas rocket launchers. And then there's also a battalion, currently I think of rifles, and that's like a sort of force projection thing there. If they want to use that, take that force anywhere else in the Middle East, they're slightly closer to it, and they do some of their training out there, sort of hotter weather training out there. So that's ostensibly it. And also there's quite a lot of shenanigans going on with the Russians. The Russians are desperate to get inside those bases and have run all sorts of operations to try and ensnare British troops, honey traps and the rest of it. And there's no sign of Britain wanting to give it up, but B, either the Greeks or the Turks or the Cypriots wanting them to go.
Well, I think as a long-term ambition for many ordinary Greek Cypriots, certainly they'd like to see the bases go. But the position taken by successive political leaders across the political spectrum, in actual fact, for decades has been that the first target and the first goal has got to be to get Turkey off the island. And then, you open up the debate about what to do with the bases. I mean, as the name suggests, they're sovereign territory. They were established at the same moment as the creation of the Republic. So it's legally, Britain feels in a very strong position, although, for anyone who's been following the Chagos Islands case recently, a few years ago, which came to attention recently when the government announced that it was actually handing it over to Mauritius, that was something that was followed very, very closely by the Cypriot government. And a lot of people feel that Cyprus has got its eye on maybe trying to pursue that. But I don't think there's any sign of it at the moment. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of Cyprus over certainly the past decade, is when I first came here. So my ties to Cyprus go back about 35 years. Cyprus was very suspicious of Britain and the United States. And although I think there's still a bit of suspicion about Britain, there has been this fundamental transformation in the relationship, especially with the United States in the past decade, and also with the UK. So now you will have high-level visits. So Keir Starmer became the first British Prime Minister to visit Cyprus since the early 1970s, just a few months ago. You have regular trips by defence secretaries. So this is something that, we're seeing an upgrading of Cyprus's integration into all sorts of European and Western defence networks. It can't join NATO, partly because traditionally there's been a strong communist party in Cyprus which has opposed it, but Turkey would also veto it. So what I think we're seeing is an upgrading of those connections in all sorts of ways, and that is pushing the Russians out as well. And that's a fascinating story, that relationship with Russia. But it's certainly not as strong as it once was. Although, as Nick says, there's very much a sense of Russian troublemaking where possible. But this is something we see all over the place. The Balkans.
And what about nuclear facilities, aircraft? What are the bases?
Well, it's rumoured, but it's not something that obviously is sort of announced or there's any specific information that we can say for certain. But, there's long been a sense that, yes, maybe there are sort of nuclear weapons stored on the bases. But it's very much in the realm of speculation more than anything. Yeah.
OK, let's get another question. Peter, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, or Pieter. Go ahead, open your microphone and ask your question. It's on the bottom left-hand side, and if you can't get to it shortly, I think his question was going to be about gas fields. Obviously, a huge number of gas fields opening up between Lebanese and Israeli territory, but also off the Cypriot coastline as well.
Yes, and I think you'll remember the very interesting conversation we had with Fiona, who is a very dear old friend of mine. And
Fiona Mullen, who's an analyst who's based in Nicosia.
Yeah, and one of my oldest friends, and we've long been on different sides on gas. So she knows it all inside out. I've always been really, really skeptical about the gas element. I think on two grounds. One, I think it's more problems than it's worth, and it will get in the way of a settlement. But there is another body of opinion that thinks it's going to open the way for a settlement. But I don't think we've seen a lot of evidence of that. But actually, what's really interesting is that, of course, this is something that's been debated now for a decade, but the world is moving. There's a lot more talk of renewables. The interesting thing, and I'm just encountering this, so I'm building a house at the moment, and we've just got the panels installed, or the framework for the panels, the photovoltaic panels put on our roof. And the news has just broken that the grid cannot absorb any more of this solar energy. So a lot of people who've invested, thank you very much, I just found out in getting these panels, are finding that, the massive savings they were expecting to make. And it's actually been a really big scandal because Cyprus imports a lot of very dirty oil to heat and provide electricity during the winters. It's getting fined by the European Commission for doing so. It's passed on, obviously, to consumers. Our bills here are a lot higher than they should be. And this is a place which gets more than 300 days of sunshine every year. It should be completely self-sufficient. It doesn't have heavy industry, and yet this is a big. So this is, if you want to know what's exercising people, and there's a big political scandal here. It's about electricity and now water. So these are the big questions which the government is having to grapple with.
I do want to just show a couple more things because I just think it's really worth saying that there's one place that's opened up recently, and I'm going to finally figure out how to enlarge the screen. I want to go back. These slides here are a ship that supposedly took part in the quote-unquote Turkish liberation in 1974. It's a landing ship. But I wanted to take us back to here, and this is Varosha. Which is was a sort of booming holiday resort in 1974 until Turkish aircraft came in and deliberately attacked it, causing thousands to flee. And this town has been kept in a time warp, completely untouched, until just last year when tourists have been allowed back in and they've paved these new roads. And we walked in, and it's surreal. And there's on the tour we met a lawyer. Perhaps I won't say his name, but his story is absolutely incredible. How his family's owned one of those apartments, and he seeks to try and return some of the art to his family. And the art was on the apartment walls. And the story about him trying to get there and get it back is an incredible one, absolutely amazing. But Varosha, perhaps more than anything else on the island, shows you what happened in 1974 and you literally walk back 50 years and see what happened on that day.
Yeah, the old Barclays Bank signs and, Olympic Airways logos and things like that. I mean, it really is a time warp. And as you said, I mean, in the late 60s, early 70s, it was terribly glamorous, to go to Greece and to Cyprus. It was a long haul destination. I mean, people often, it's a member of the European Union, but it really is very much the European Union's Middle East outpost. I mean, from where I'm talking to you now, it's about, if I go directly east, about 80 miles away, it's Syria. It really is Middle Eastern. And so it was a place before mass package tourism. It was sort of, the jet set would go there and things. And Famagusta really did sort of, represent that. And as you say, they just opened it up in the past few years and opening up more parts of it. And many Greeks.
It's controversial because essentially it's an area that had not been taken by the Turks. And is this a step towards, asserting greater sort of Turkish Cypriot sovereignty over the area? And they say they want to return it to what it was and restore it. And there are ideas among some Greek Cypriot families to sort of try and bring the place back to life again, and perhaps they can get their property in the process. So it raises sort of possibly opportunities too as well, but it's still controversial. But that's a place we look at. I do want to say something about Nicosia and also this wonderful gentleman here on the left, Mete Hate, who's we'll just say a bit about Mete and just say a bit about him.
Mete's a bit of a legendary figure. So he's an academic and an analyst who is a wonderful source of knowledge on what's going on in the north. He's also quite a well-known DJ who goes by the name Uncle Mete, and he electronic dance music. It's a very incongruous sort of mixture, but Mete is a fascinating character and a bit of a legend, as I say here in Cyprus circles, so he really he just knows everything that needs to be known about the north and what's going on and development. Because I think one of the things that we've already touched on is the demographic situation in the north. It's very precarious. It's subject to a lot of secrecy. We don't know exactly how many Turkish Cypriots there are, how many Turkish nationals there are, how many foreigners there are. But as I say, his best estimate now is the Turkish Cypriots probably represent, out of an entire population of about 500,000, 550,000, maybe 125,000. So, they're a minority now in the north. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I wanted to point out was, going to the north, it is actually much of this. It is in a way better preserved than parts of the south, and here is a very good illustration in Nicosia, and you can see the boundary line. I've forgotten the official name now for that. The end of the street is literally sealed off. You've got the Turkish Cypriot side here, and then on the Greek Cypriots on the other side. But it's stunningly beautiful. It's a really wonderful place to visit. If we've got no more questions, I think we're going to wrap it up there. I think just one last thing. You're before we go, how much hope do you have this is going to be settled in any way? Are people just merely going through the motions? And what would be good signs of progress? What would be the initial things, do you think, to sort of show that things are moving forward?
Well, I can say for certainly what aren't the good signs of progress is that the last time the two leaders met with the UN Secretary General, they promised that they were going to begin talks on various confidence-building measures. I've always been skeptical about confidence-building measures. It soaks up so much oxygen and leads to bad will. But one of the things they've been talking about is opening up more crossing points. So over the years, more and more crossing points have opened. And this is something that should be relatively easy. There's a lot of public pressure to do this. It's status neutral. So the Greek Cypriots say, yes, we want to open up more crossing points because this is paving the way for reunification. The Turkish Cypriots can say, well, we want to open up more crossing points because even if we don't believe in reunification, we do believe in having a good relationship with our southern neighbours, and this is a way of doing it. So it should be relatively uncontroversial, and it's gone nowhere. And so there is a sense that this really is an indication of just how bad things are. I'd like to say I've always been an optimist about Cyprus. I've always believed that a settlement is in the best interest, but whereas I still believe that it's still in the best interest of the island, I have to say that I'm finding it more and more difficult to retain that optimism. It is now 50 years since the island was divided. It's 60 years since we saw, the outbreak of problems, which, before I was born. And here we are, and it just doesn't seem, it really is. Sometimes it is that old angels dancing on the head of pins, when you're dealing with Cyprus. So they've always said it's the diplomat's graveyard, is that sort of thing that, there've been so many envoys who've come and gone. So I think to sum it up, I would like to think that it's still possible, but I think with every passing year, it really does become more difficult. And as I say, I think on the trip we did, the one moment that really hammered it home to me was going and seeing that development over in Trikomo, in Iskele, as they call it in Turkish. And it was truly an eye-opener, just these rows and rows of these massive blocks, and thinking, it's very hard to see reunification happening. But hope continues.
Yeah. Well, James Ker-Lindsay, thank you very much. It's been a really, really informative 50 minutes. Thanks very much, and team, for your time.
Thank you.